I think a materialist approach to things is very, very consistent with my experience in Christian social justice.
I feel like the deeper I get into anarchist practice, the deeper my faith is getting at the same time.
I would hope that, securing means of life for all would be something all people of faith would say, oh yes, that's at the basis of what we believe.
Those who are most marginalized know the most about the true, the good, and the beautiful.
To me, it's less that I think building class solidarity is a bad thing, as much as it seems like if you don't attend to things like anti-Black racism, that's always going to get in the way of building class solidarity, actually.
And when you go back, you find that a lot of revolutionary grassroots participatory movements, the precursors to what you could call the barrio assemblies and these grassroots neighborhood organizations, a lot of these were sponsored by the church.
What does it mean to say that the Christian tradition is internally contradictory and there are antagonisms there and you're always being faithful to some aspects and betraying other aspects?
Welcome to the Magnificast, a podcast about Christianity and leftist politics. I'm Matt Bernico. I teach media studies at Greenville University in Greenville, Illinois.
I'm Dean Detloff. I'm a PhD student at the Institute for Christian Studies in Toronto. And hey, you know what? I didn't even plan on this, but I just turned 29 because it's midnight, my birthday.
Oh, hey, happy birthday. What are your birthday resolutions?
Oh my gosh, I hadn't even been thinking about this all year. I had a whole year to think about it.
Oh no.
Be it resolved that in a year I will turn 30 years old. That's one.
I'm
going to get to 30 by the end of this year.
You can do it.
I can do it. I got a haircut today. I got a birthday haircut, and I think that the last haircut I got was about a year ago. So that's pretty good.
I was there for it, I think, wasn't I?
Yeah, I think that's right. Or shortly thereafter.
Yeah, I remember being with you, and you went to get a haircut.
Yeah, yep. So there you go. That's the big milestone. Already on the right path, I think.
Yeah, get that traditional birthday haircut. You got the big plan to turn 30 in another year. That's good.
Yeah, I've got my whole end of my 20s ahead of me here.
Well, I turned 30 last year. It doesn't feel very different. I think that once you turn 25, you're just kind of 25 mentally forever. And physically you get worse.
I feel that way. Yeah, that's right. My bones already hurt, so I feel fine about that.
Oh yeah. You're gonna get more of it. It's gonna be great. You're gonna love it.
Yeah. My bones hurt, my blood hurts, sometimes my brain hurts.
Mm-hmm.
I mean the new thing in my dumb old cranky body is sometimes I just get headaches for no good reason. So, I don't know. There are so many worse things that could have happened to me. By the time I got here, I feel pretty good about it.
Yeah, well, good. Okay, so apart from Dean's big birthday news, there's some other really big news this week about Ernesto Cardenal. Dean, do you want to, as the birthday boy, to tell us about it?
Yeah, sure. I will save you from being a Protestant having to say anything about this whole situation.
Thank you.
So Cardenal, is in the news. That's right. He's in the news because he was recently rehabilitated by Pope Francis. And I'll say a little bit about that. So we decided to do an episode on Ernesto Cardenal in light of this event, which is more significant than I think a lot of people realize, both people on the left and people in the Christian community. It's a really huge deal that you might kind of miss just by seeing a picture of, an old man getting hanging out with a cardinal or something. There's a lot more going on. So here's a little bit of background. So in 1984, Ernesto Cardenal got suspended from ministry as a Catholic priest by Pope John Paul II. Because Cardenal joined the revolutionary Sandinista government in Nicaragua. He was the Minister of Culture for the government there. And on February 17th, so last Sunday, his suspension was lifted or removed by Pope Francis. So that might sound like some boring Catholic legal problem, and in some ways it is, but it's actually also very important. And this is in a couple of ways. So symbolically, it's important because it means that there's one more radical priest that Pope Francis decided to welcome back into the Catholic mainstream. It's not like Cardinal was excommunicated, but he was definitely pushed to the fringe. And that's along with like people like Gustavo Gutierrez or Leonardo Boff. Like Francis is really bringing these people in as like valuable dialogue partners in the church instead of kind of keeping them at bay, which is what had happened in the past. And it also matters spiritually, I think, because Father Cardinal is now able to celebrate Mass as a priest and live out his priestly vocation the way that he was meant to. Even though it sucks that he's 94 years old and had to wait so long, it's still very important if you're a Catholic priest to be able to do that. So all that to say, it is a really big deal because basically what this event means in particular, this specific sort of moment, is that Pope Francis is recognizing that a person who was a real revolutionary and part of a real revolutionary government is welcome as a full priestly member of the church, which is a big deal if you're a Catholic, but also if you're just a Christian who is interested in how Christians participate in leftist projects and in revolutionary projects.
Yeah, it is super interesting. It's hard for me, Protestant, to really get my mind around what exactly is happening here. When the big news dropped about Ernesto Cardenal, it was cool. I remember thinking like, oh, cool, something happened with him. And then like I saw all these tradcaths who were just like losing their mind about it, and I had no idea what was going on. It's kind of like a reverse Big Brother kind of situation, you know? Like Pope John Paul evicted Cardinal from the house, but now he's back. He's getting back in the house.
He won the battle back. That's right.
The power of veto just really kicked in here or something.
Yeah, just a really, really long time on the block. Didn't get evicted at the end.
It's good. Wow. Love that Big Brother.
Here's a little bit more like boring details to it. So, okay. When he was removed from ministry by Pope John Paul II, the thing that was cited by the Pope at that point was a clause in the Catholic Church that says that priests can't be, well, to paraphrase it, they can't be like civil authorities or governmental agents. That's like a thing they're not supposed to do. And, like, in fairness to the Pope, that is exactly what Ernesto Cardenal decided to do. So, like, he did break the rule. But it's not, I mean, there's all kinds of ways of interpreting exactly how you should respond to that. And eventually he did step down from being a minister of culture for a number of reasons, a lot of political reasons, not sort of related to him being a Catholic priest. But he was never returned to ministry after that or anything. And his brother was also similarly reprimanded, but he stepped down earlier and had a different kind of situation. So anyway, that's kind of more of the like boring legal mumbo jumbo that is all sort of in the past now anyway.
Yeah, that's super interesting. There's not even anything like analogous in Protestantism, really. No one gets in trouble for anything. The only thing that could happen is that you get like kicked out of your church because you were too bad of a person or something. Well, cool. Yeah, I mean, we've talked about Father Cardinal in the past, especially for our Christmas episode, the first Christmas episode, not the most recent one. And then we did another one a while back, too, just about the Gospel in Solentiname. That's a book that Cardinal edited where he transcribed the conversations that he and the Catholic peasants had around different stories in the Bible. So this week we decided to dive into his life a little bit more, not maybe focus on the Gospel in Solentiname, but focus like on kind of like what he was about as a person, and get into a little bit of his biography. Father Cardinal wrote a ton of really amazing poetry books, like so many. We were just like kind of looking through them before we got started, and there's a gazillion of them. There's even one about...
They're pretty wild.
Yeah, they are wild. There's one about UFOs and like indigenous culture, and I want to read that one a lot, actually. The problem with all the poetry books, though, is that Dean and I don't know anything about poetry, and I think that we're not people who are well suited to comment on it. So we're gonna save everyone that pain. So instead, we just found these two articles that try to contextualize his life a little bit and say something interesting about him that maybe we didn't know. So like Dorothy Day, he also had a Cuba blog. He had a book and he talks about his trip to Cuba, and maybe we'll come back around to that in the future. But we just did the Dorothy Day Cuba blog, and his is actually not all that different. So we thought we would bracket that for a bit.
Yeah. So we should say up front, I guess, what the two articles are and what we're gonna pull out of them. So one is an article called Ernesto Cardenal and the Nicaraguan Revolution, From Theological Theory to Revolutionary Praxis. It's by a guy named Rudolph J. Siebert. and it is from 1980, which is really important because that is like at the height of sort of the Sandinista experiment. So that's a really interesting article, and it kind of gives you a flavor of like what Cardenal was communicating as a person, like in his very life, kind of the things that he was getting people to think about. And the other is an article called War in Paradise, Solentiname and the Sandinista Revolution. And this is from 2015. It's actually in a journal called Visual Studies, which is great because it's sort of a look more at like the arts community out of which Cardenal emerged, and also the one that he like really helped to sort of nurture. And you could kind of see that arts community as his training ground for what he would end up doing in the Sandinista government, which is really radical and amazing. So anyway, those are the two articles, and we'll work through first a little bit from the Siebert article on Cardenal's life, and then talk a little bit more about the art scene.
Yeah, sounds good. So if you don't know anything about Ernesto Cardenal, let me tell you some things. Here are some things. He was born in Granada in 1925. He spent most of the 1940s traveling around to Mexico and U.S. and throughout Europe. In 1950, he came back to Nicaragua, and 4 years later was part of a failed coup against the Somoza dictatorship. Somoza is the dictator that they overthrew later during the Sandinista Revolution. So that's a name we'll say a few times. So just he's the bad guy. But after the coup, the first coup failed, he moved to Kentucky, of all places, and lived in the same Trappist monastery as Thomas Merton in 1957. So that's pretty weird. One of those things, again, where I'm amazed that people are alive at the same time. A couple years later, though, he studied theology in Mexico and eventually came back to Nicaragua, where he was ordained as a priest in 1965. In Solentiname, which is a chain of islands, an archipelago in Nicaragua, he was a leader in a radical arts community that's basically just a commune, honestly, that was focused on art. And he also worked with leftists to ferment a revolution and kind of give that revolution some like religious energy, serving as like a priest in that community. In 1977, his community was brutally attacked and he fled to Costa Rica. But after the success of the Sandinista Revolution, he was named the Minister of Culture in the revolutionary government, which is kind of why John Paul II got so mad in the first place.
Yeah, that's good. That's a good lightning round of facts about Ernesto Cardenal.
All the facts you need to know.
Side note, I just want to say this because I heard this today from Dave McKee, the Ontario leader of the Communist Party of Canada. We were talking about this happening, and he referred to Pope John Paul II as J2P2, and it made me laugh very hard. So anyway, you can all have that one for free, courtesy of Dave McKee.
That's pretty good. Well, so if you need a quick refresher in your brain, The Gospel in Solentiname is a really dope book, and it's 4 volumes, and for some reason, no one on the internet can seem to find any of them but the first one. I don't know. There's like not a good PDF of them all, but there's a PDF of volume 1 at least, and we've talked about it on the show a few times. It's a pretty cool book. What I like about the book so much is that it's really just like the transcriptions of these like leftist farmers in Solentiname in Nicaragua, and just talking about what Bible verses might mean, and all these really funny characters kind of emerge out from them. That they all have sort of these like reoccurring themes that they always will bring up, and they're all really nice. And it's a good book. It's a cool book where you get to read, you read the scripture along with people that you, most United States and North American Christians would never get to read the scripture with. So there you go. Yeah, that's The Gospel in Solentiname. Go check it out if you've never read it. Go listen to our episode about it. It's pretty good.
It is pretty good. It's a really neat book, too, because, well, 2 things that are cool about it. One is it really demonstrates the kind of stuff that a lot of radical pedagogy theorists talk about, like Paulo Freire. This really, like, decentralized way of just sort of trusting people to come up with the really revolutionary ideas through dialogical exchange. And, like, you see that totally demonstrated and performed, which is really neat. And the other is you get a real window into the kind of like liberating themes that come out from the Bible when you read it with the oppressed, which I think is amazing because like some of the insights that they have are so unique and really creative, and like really changed the way that I look at a ton of biblical stories that I heard like a bazillion times. So that's pretty neat.
It is neat. Something that we talked about on this show a lot is sometimes, or just like how the sort of the lived lives of other leftist Christians, sometimes like it feels like they give us permission to also be leftist Christians. And reading that book is a really good example of how that kind of comes to be true. You know, when you read some kind of like I don't know, when you hear us when you hear us talk about like liberation theology or talking about communism and Christianity, it's like fine or whatever. But when you like read it in the words of the campesinos in Nicaragua, it's a little bit different, a little bit of a different feel to it, and it's good.
Yeah, it is good. The first podcast.
That's right. Okay, so kind of getting into the articles that we read this week a little bit. The first one we're going to take a look at is Ernesto Cardenal and the Nicaraguan Revolution by Rudolph J. Siebert. And this piece needs a little bit of contextualization to kind of understand like what the heck is even going on in it. So, okay. I'm trying to unpack it the best I can. It's kind of weird. So the point of Siebert's article is to reflect on Ernesto Cardenal's acceptance of this like award in Germany. So they decided to give Ernesto Cardenal the Peace Prize of the German Publishers Association. And Cardenal shows up and accepts that award, and that's pretty cool. I don't really know much about that prize or that award or like why it's relevant, but it is not the point. The stuff that's said about Cardenal from Siebert's reflection and also the Siebert's kind of recollection of Cardenal's address is kind of the point behind this whole article. Who cares about the award? But it's a point where Cardenal shows up and starts talking about Nicaragua and Christianity and what all of that means. So yeah, who cares about the award? But the stuff that Cardenal ends up saying about the revolution is really good. Okay, so there's a lot going on. There's a lot going on in this article. Some of it is about Johann Metz and some stuff that he said about Cardenal, but we're going to kind of skip that and bracket it. Johann Metz, as Dean told me more about him, he seems cool, but he's not Ernesto Cardenal. So we're going to get to Cardenal stuff. We're jumping like midway through the article. So the cliff notes are seriously abridged here. Okay, so Siebert, reflecting on Cardenal, says this. At the beginning of his acceptance speech, he recognized the paradox of the situation. A man who defended and praised the armed struggle of his people, receiving the famous Peace Prize, was extremely significant. He argued the Nicaraguan people searched for peace with their bloody struggles. This peace, which has now been achieved, means more than merely the absence of war. Cardenal thinks of peace described by the old Hebrew prophets, shalom, a peace which is also justice. Shalom means the peaceful living together with one another, all harvest their wine in peace. So this very first piece here, this very first bit here is interesting because a big portion of what Cardenal is going to talk about in this address is his position as a Catholic priest, as a faithful Christian, and also his relationship with a violent revolution. So that's right, y'all. We're going to talk about violence here in a second.
Can't stop, won't stop.
There's nothing you can do to stop this.
Short of your own violence.
That might make us stop.
I would stop in that instance.
Yeah.
So going on a little bit, yeah, Siebert is kind of reflecting more on this paradox of peace and violence and teases out a little bit more about that shalom stuff. So he talks about how, according to Cardenal, in the Hebrew Bible, people could have had this kind of peace even in the midst of war, he says. It was possible for war to be waged for shalom. This is also the peace of Jesus, who greeted his disciples with shalom, peace be with you. But Cardenal reminded his audience, Jesus also said that he came to bring the sword and the fire, and that the nature of fire is to burn. I think that is a really fascinating thing. It's something that comes up in a lot of Cardenal's life, and not only because he participated in the Sandinista Revolution, but because he had so many friends within the kind of global Catholic community by virtue of studying and wandering around in so many places, that those friends were also kind of nervous about his sort of openness to violence as a political solution. So famously, like, he had a kind of weird relationship with Daniel Berrigan, who was a famous Jesuit priest in the U.S. who was part of the peace movement. A really amazing guy, but a very resolute pacifist. So that was a kind of point of contention we'll talk about more in a minute. And then another was Thomas Merton. He had a really interesting exchange for many, many years, though at one point the monastery actually forbidden Cardinal and Merton to exchange letters for like several years, which is pretty crazy because of Cardinal's political activities. But in any case, I think that this is a really cool way of thinking about the tension between peace and violence, because it is both, like, on the one hand, coming from somebody who's theorizing it in a certain way, like he's thought a ton about it, but also it's coming from somebody who has lived on like every side of it, like lived on the side where he was the recipient of violence, lived on the side of when violence was used against that structural violence, and then lastly lived on the side of the peace that was established after that kind of all settled down or leveled out. And I think that, like, I don't know, there's just a lot to be learned from a life that is kind of marked by being in so many different relationships to those different like stages in the struggle.
Yeah, for sure. Well, Siebert goes on to talk more about Cardinal's more like nuanced position on violence. And I think it is kind of good to play up this, may not play it up, but like recognize this tension that like Cardinal is a person who is open to this type of revolutionary violence, and that there are people around him who are, you know, Christians who feel kind of like weird about that openness to violence. But then Siebert says this bit here, which I appreciate, that I think is a good thing to keep in mind, as Christians might be wary of violence or something. So Siebert says, Cardinal insisted it was entirely evil for certain officials in the church to have shamelessly blessed weapons of oppressors in the past, both in South America and elsewhere. Pius XII blessed the weapons of the Italian fascist army when it set out to conquer Albania, and today churches in Albania are closed. I don't know about that now. But whatever. It's 1980. Cardinal Spellman blessed the weapons of the unjust Vietnam War, and their actions, Pius XII and Cardinal Spellman, followed a very old tradition of Constantinian Christendom. For Cardinal, it is something completely different when the church blesses the weapons of the oppressed victims who try to defend themselves against their despotic murderers. The blessings of the weapons of the masters is completely different from the blessing of the oppressed victims, since the weapons are so unequal. It's not the same for the church to bless the sword of Goliath and the stone of David. So here we see that that nuance that I think is really necessary for these types of conversations about violence in Christianity. Violence is not always like is not equal. It's not the same thing. I think there's a part in this article where, or maybe it was a different one that I'm thinking of, but where Cardinal is reflecting on like the Somoza regime dropping napalm on the Nicaraguan people, and saying like, listen, that's like, this is very different than guerrillas fighting against the Somoza regime. Like napalm and like, you know, AK-47s or whatever are wildly different types of weapons with wildly different types of motivations and relationships between those things. So this type of nuance is one that we're good at playing up on this show, and look, we're doing it again, and it's still good.
Yeah, I think it is good. It's good not because violence is good, but just because the problems are real, and it doesn't do us any good to sort of ignore them.
Yeah, it's right. Violence is still not good. I'm still gonna ride that line until I die. But it's also, so violence is not good, but it is also a violence to like try to call out all types of violence as being equal, or, you know,
right.
A whataboutism of violence. That's bad.
Yeah, that's right. Well, here's a good way of kind of dramatizing this a little bit. So I mentioned Daniel Berrigan earlier, and he's mentioned in the Siebert article in a really interesting way. So a little bit more background on Berrigan, because I do want to establish his like radical credentials, because he's genuinely very cool.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, he's an amazing person. He did all kinds of wild stuff. One of the things he's most famous for is being part of a group called the Catonsville Nine. His brother and many other people are part of it as well. But they broke into an office and stole a bunch of draft documents and then burned them using homemade napalm. And they all eventually were tried for it, but Daniel Berrigan especially like ran from the federal government for a really long time. And he was like hiding out in like people's basements and like spare rooms and stuff, just as like wild Jesuit, occasionally like writing poetry and stuff while he's doing it. So anyway, he did a lot more than that, but that's kind of one of the big things that he's famous for. And I say that because I think it's important to establish that like the difference between Berrigan and Cardenal is definitely not a difference of like like some people have sort of like lofty ideals, but they've never struggled, and like other people don't. It's like both of these guys had super lofty ideals and they both struggled a lot for them. But in any case, there is a significant difference of principle between them, and this is how Siebert sort of sorts it out. So he says, during the revolution in Nicaragua, the Jesuit Berrigan wrote an open letter to Cardenal in which he condemned Cardenal's defense of the violent Sandinista movement and struggle. Not even the highest principles, so Berrigan argued, can outweigh the life of one single child. In his acceptance speech, Cardenal answered Berrigan by saying that he agrees completely. The Sandinistas fought for the life of thousands of men and women, of old people and children, who were murdered day after day. The highest principle, even that of radical pacifism, cannot weigh as much as a single one of these children. I think that is a really amazing thing. I mean, personally, I think that Cardenal is right. Or at least the way that he puts it here kind of spells out the like real scale of actual material lives that the conflict is dealing with. But what I think is so important is that like both of these positions are kind of centered around the dignity of human beings, and the question of violence kind of stems from that in both directions. So I don't know. I think Cardenal gives a really good rejoinder to Berrigan there on that point, and just kind of forces us to ask the question of like, what did these principles that we hold ethically or as good Christians or whatever really mean when it comes down to the day-to-day life of most human people, and even when most of those human people can all be sort of understood as like singular worthy individuals or something of that nature.
Yeah, it's a really good response that I think does justice to it. It does demonstrate too that it's not like Cardinal being open to violence as a means of struggle doesn't mean like he loves violence or something, but because he says that he agrees with Berrigan in kind of this counterintuitive way, but still it's like you fight for the people that Berrigan is saying that he cares about, so it makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's good.
Okay, so moving forward a little bit, more on violence and death and some kind of wild stuff. Siebert reports Cardinal saying something like this. The whole Nicaraguan nation was ready to die, for only through total commitment could the nation liberate itself from Somoza's despotism. Many Sandinistas fell in the furious battle, but only through their deaths is Nicaragua free today. The flag of the Sandinistas is black and red. Sandino, or Augusto Sandino, he's like the leader of the movement, explained that black means death and red the free fatherland. He also once said that black means death and red signifies resurrection. Cardinal seems convinced that the young Sandinistas who gave their blood in the Liberation War did so out of love. They did not die in order to die. They have been resurrected. In other words, liberation in political theology is historical materialism with God and freedom and with immortality. This is actually a really heavy thing if you think about it. It's interesting to think about, the black and the red of Sandinistas meaning death and resurrection. But it does, I think just like in the Berrigan quote above, or the Berrigan bit above, we see here Cardinal thinking through the actual like material consequences of war, but also like why that war of liberation was actually fought. Not to die just to die, but also to die so like the rest of the country can be resurrected as something different. The last line is really striking too. The political theology is historical materialism with God. It's a wild thing to say, but that is a way that you can that's a way that Cardinal thinks about this war of liberation, that it is a resurrection kind of moment.
Yeah, especially that historical materialism with God stuff is really interesting. It just reminds me a lot of a point that Walter Benjamin makes in the Concept of History essay, where he talks about how like there's if the Antichrist wins, he says, then even the dead won't be safe from that kind of end of history. And he also talks about having this important kind of memory of the people who have fallen in the labor struggle as almost like a weird communion of saints for the left. And I think that this is a really great example of what Benjamin is saying. Like, it's not just theoretical. Like, if the Somoza dictatorship had won, all these deaths would have been not in vain, but certainly, they would have not been resurrected in a kind of glorious way, as they were by the Sandinista victory.
Yeah, I mean, if Somoza would have won, those names would have been erased from history. I mean, you wouldn't.
Yeah.
It would have been a different thing. Well, there's another part where Siebert says this: for many Nicaraguan Christians, the recent history of their country recalls the Easter story of death and resurrection. For them, participation in the revolution meant nothing less than faithfulness to Jesus Christ. So just, I mean, kind of ripping off that historical materialism with God, this is what the revolution meant to them, a rebirth, and then it's kind of a messianic moment.
Yeah, that's right. And speaking of that too, that messianic moment, it's also kind of interesting to think through the kingdom of God and what it means to build that on earth.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a way in which you can understand that with respect to the Sandinistas. So Siebert draws it out like this. He says, at present, Cardenal is not focusing on the possibility of counter-revolution, but on the revolution itself and its goal, a love of neighbor. Great works of love have been accomplished in the new Nicaragua since the end of the War of Liberation a year ago at the time of writing this article. Formerly sinful structures have been overthrown by works of love, and what are they? They are the relentless struggle against the inner enemy of ignorance and illiteracy, the conquering of unemployment and inflation, the nationalization of banks and foreign trade, the care of widows and orphans left behind by the War of Liberation, the reform of healthcare, education in the state, land reform, cultural revolution, and protection of nature. I think that describing this as a work of love, it's like all these things are extremely banal. Like, they're like just day-to-day changes in how people live their day-to-day lives. But that is like a historical materialism with God, I think you could put it. This is like one way of realizing what hopefully life would be like in some kind of messianic future, but we don't have to wait that long if we don't want to. I think that's really the challenge that the Sandinistas give to the rest of the world, is like, why wait when we could build it here? And it's a really massive challenge.
Yeah, you get the feeling that the way that Cardenal thinks about like revolution is, or maybe like what that historical materialism with God means, is that like it is this sort of like actual struggle for liberation, but also there's a sense in which revolution has a lot to do with like spiritual conversion, and not maybe in the Christian sense explicitly, but in the sense of like, you change those really banal things about your life. That's like, a really important thing. You change them through love. You make your life about works of love rather than, the accumulation of capital or all the other bad stuff in the world. So, I don't know. Cardinal, it seems like those banal moments are really important for him.
Yeah, for sure. So let's transition slowly to the other article, but before we do, we got to talk about that good boy Fidel Castro, who gets mentioned in this article. So Siebert says, Fidel Castro recently remarked apropos the situation in Nicaragua and El Salvador that Christians no longer merely dialogue with Marxists, but also participate in practical and effective revolutions. In Nicaragua, the Christian Marxist dialogue, as analyzed in political and liberation theology, has shown one of its first fruits. Political and liberation theology and the Christian Marxist dialogue are to be known by their fruits, that is, by their revolutionary works of love. I think that's a really encouraging thing. I mean, we saw that already in the Fidel and Religion book that we read. We did a whole episode on that where Fidel kind of talks about this a little bit more. But it's an amazing thing to think about the Christian Marxist dialogue not as a like working out different theoretical differences between these two camps, but characterized by what actually happens in the world as a result of those two camps talking with one another and really working together, that kind of bearing fruit. Christians will be known by their love or whatever, I think is a really important thing to think about when works of love have material instantiations or material manifestations.
2019, bear that fruit.
Bear that fruit, 2019.
Yeah. Okay. Also, before we move on, I want to read the last bit of Siebert's article, because it's good, and it talks about Benjamin again, so you gotta do it. So yeah, the article ends with this line. It's a good one. There are Christians alive again for whom, in Walter Benjamin's words, every second in the future can be a little door through which the Messiah enters. I think that's a good way to kind of encapsulate what Cardenal's about, though. The conversion experience, the material struggle, the future is open to the messianic in a good way.
Yeah, that's right. Well, I think that's actually a really good way to transition to the art stuff, just because you get that sensibility in what Cardenal is doing with his kind of focus on the arts. So in addition to being like a really cool real life militant revolutionary, Cardenal is also a poet, like we said earlier, and he's a member of kind of like the artistic community of the world generally, and then obviously specifically in Solentiname. And those two things are really importantly connected. So you can't just say like, well, Cardenal was a kind of militant. Like one reason that he was because he was also an artist. And these two things really inform each other. Like in the same way, he is an artist because he's a revolutionary. And he's doing all that stuff before the Sandinista revolution, and then afterwards, his role in the government is essentially to help the people of Nicaragua learn how to embrace and produce their own culture and to disseminate it amongst themselves without the kind of fear of the dictatorship and also the sort of bourgeois controls on how culture gets disseminated or curated or appropriated and that kind of a thing. And I think it's important to focus on this, not just because it's part of Cardinal's history, but also because it tells us a lot of really important things about, what the relationship between like utopia and material struggle is like, what the relationship between symbolic victory and real victory is like. And it's a lot more kind of uplifting actually, and sort of encouraging than I think a lot of leftists like permit themselves to be, and including myself. So this other article that we read tries to actually zero in on Solentiname in particular and ask different questions about like what did that commune look like and what was happening there and how did all of these things kind of feed in to each other. So it's a really, really great and sort of rare article, I think, that does a good job balancing all these different interests.
Yeah, I think to set the scene a little bit more, we can say that, well, okay, in the past episode we did on the Gospel in Solentiname, I think like we focused on, well, I mean, in the book, what you hear, who you hear from are, the campesinos, the farmers. But while they are there, and they're the people who, lived on the archipelagos before Cardinal probably showed up. What is interesting, though, is that Cardinal, like, he's there with the farmers for sure, but, like, he's there with other revolutionaries who are on the island and other artists that are on the island. They basically start, like, a little Christian commune, and they make art, and they figure out, like, poetry, and they paint, and they do sculptures and stuff. So this is like, there's a lot of moving parts to Solentiname that's not just like farmers living on an island. It's not just communists, but it's like kind of both of these two pieces like coexisting.
Yeah, that's right. So here's like one kind of interesting way that the article tries to explain this situation. So it says, connected through vast networks of revolutionary writers, artists, and intellectuals, the ideologies introduced to the islands by Cardenal and his group led to the formation of novel socio-political categories, impossible to achieve otherwise under an authoritarian gaze, establishing trends that were both specific to the Nicaraguan context and symptomatic of the broader political climate at the time. And I think this is really like a good way of encapsulating it, right? It's this network of all kinds of different revolutionaries. Mm-hmm. And when they like start getting their hands dirty, and like when people who have dirty hands by virtue of their actual work are encouraged to make art and like start thinking about the Bible for themselves and like, embrace their own perspectives, like a lot of wild stuff starts happening.
Yeah, for sure. So all this really interesting revolutionary art gets created. There's like sort of an artistic movement that is an artistic school that's like sort of unique to this specific place and time called Primitivista. So we can talk about maybe some of that art in a minute too. But something else really interesting that happens that kind of comes out of this time when they're together in Solentiname is the writing of something that's just called the Nicaraguan Peasants' Mass. So the Peasants' Mass is a liturgical mass composition that incorporated regional folklore and popular music from throughout Nicaragua, including indigenous languages and oral traditions. So it was first released in 1975 and then immediately censored by the Somoza government because it was, an act of Christian worship that was explicitly subversive. So it is like actually set to music, but it's in Spanish. So we found an English translation though that's pretty neat. Something that makes me pretty excited, I think, actually. Should we just read it?
Yeah, we can read part of it for sure.
Okay. So it starts off like this. I believe in you, comrade, Christ man, Christ worker, victor over death. With your great sacrifice, you made new people for liberation. You are risen. In every arm outstretched to defend the people against the exploitation of rulers, you are alive and present in the hut, in the factory, in the school. I believe in your ceaseless struggle. I believe in your resurrection. So
yeah, you can tell why that would want why a dictator would want to censor that.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah, it is for sure something that you might want to censor if you were a dictator. But it is a really cool example of really authentic Christian worship that is infused with this like the type of politics that are present at the time.
Yeah, you should pitch this at your church.
I can't imagine it would go very well.
You never know till you try. So yeah, I mean, this is an amazing sort of like cultural product that emerged out of this this situation, and basically like this is one among countless other very intriguing artistic products. So essentially, like Cardenal helped to usher in like a whole wave of politicized Christian art that directly challenges and sometimes like indirectly challenges the Somoza dictatorship. I mean, just by virtue of existing, it sort of is already challenging that way of doing things. So there's like poetry and music and paintings and other kinds of artistic projects that really flourish throughout Solentiname, even when they're under really, really harsh conditions. So it's like a very poor region. People are not exactly like free to move around. They don't have like free floating capital and that sort of thing. And still they're like finding ways to kind of pull this out of themselves, and articulate their hopes and dreams. And then what's fascinating about that is when Cardinal becomes the Minister of Culture later, he brings with him this idea of a radically democratized arts culture that really feels like nobody is beyond artistic redemption. So, former like Somoza, like military people even are trained to like write poetry and like work through their stuff in an artistic way, right? Yeah, I don't know. There's a lot to be said about that, but I think like drawing that connection between this kind of pre-revolutionary belief in like the spirit of people, and then coupling that with like an institutionalized way of making that belief permeable throughout a whole society is a really intriguing line to draw.
Yeah, super intriguing. So one of the pieces that the article we were talking about references is by Gloria Guevara, who is a painter. And the piece is called Christ the Gorilla, and it's I don't know, you might have never seen it, but you should go Google it. Gloria Guevara, Christ the Gorilla. It's a really kind of interesting piece, and it's in this like really specific primitivista style with these like vibrant colors. Like primitivista, I'm no like great appreciator of art or understander of art history, but from what I can tell, it uses like a really similar sort of form with regards to drawing figures and like scenes, but it also uses a really similar kind of color palette that is really very interesting and pretty striking. But Christ the Gorilla is interesting because it is just what it says. Christ on the cross, but dressed as a gorilla, wearing like jeans and a shirt, and the people that are there mourning him are also sort of dressed in the contemporary dress of the day. But yeah, it's an interesting example of the ways that the folks in Solentiname were really working out these ideas at the time in like the 70s.
Yeah, that's right. And it's cool too because like all that stuff, all that symbolic energy is getting exchanged in really interesting ways, and a lot of it is like charged by Cardinal. He's definitely, I mean, I don't want to make like a great man of history kind of thing here, but he's like clearly a driving cultural force in the archipelago. And like at one point, this article talks about this cool book of photographs that centers on Cardinal. And it's described like this. It says, All snapshots and narrative fragments converge in the eponymous figure of Cardenal, the cool, wandering monk, spiritual leader, intellectual, humanist, poet, and artist. You really get the sense that this guy who spent time like in Kentucky hanging out with Thomas Merton and like was educated in Mexico and became a really famous poet is also a guy who's just kind of like a really attractive personality. It kind of reminds me of, there was this thing going around on Twitter just recently that some like crazy Reaganite Twitter account found of Bernie Sanders apparently giving an interview after he had visited Nicaragua, and he talks about Ernesto Cardenal in it, and it is very funny because he's like, yeah, I don't know, Daniel Ortega, pretty impressive guy. Ernesto Cardenal, man, what a weird dude. He's got really long hair. He's kind of like a hippie. He like says it in a very Bernie Sanders-y way. Maybe we'll have to find it for this episode or something, but I think like there's clearly a kind of like energy about Cardinal himself that just compels people to like think differently, and you really get that sense that it lends into all these wild kinds of movements.
I love that the strategy for the right to discredit Bernie Sanders is to make him out to be more of a socialist. I wish Bernie was still that much of a socialist.
Yeah, that's right. I wish he was reading some Ernesto Cardenal right now.
Yeah, it'd be dope. Cool. Well, Solentiname is this article describes it as like this kind of like moment before the revolution where a lot of the I don't know, revolutionary imagination was kind of built up. With regards to symbolism and with regards to art and just like the ideation behind some of the revolutionary, or like what the culture, like the revolutionary culture might look like. There's a part of this article that even says that the revolution is culture and culture is revolution, and I think if that's the case, then a lot of that revolutionary culture was built in Solentiname. The article does this other kind of thing that's pretty interesting, where it paints Solentiname as a type of utopic space. Or a space where at least like utopia is imagined from, and utopia here meaning like the good kind of place that you want to live, like the perfect kind of world. So the article says this: a return to that moment of contemplative descent. One might ask whether the presence of utopia, confirmed through word and image, was indeed necessary to bolster resistance against the inequality and violent abuse of the dictatorial regime. If Solentiname was a sustainable model, then a cultural revolution could conceivably succeed countrywide. While this article does not seek to evaluate either the achievements or the faults of the experiment, it prompts a valuable question, one that applies to the broader Central American context throughout the Cold War era. To what extent is utopia necessary to sustain revolutionary ideas? So this is a really, I think, provocative ending to a really neat article. Drawing out this connection, what's the connection between utopia and revolution? And there's one way, I mean, like you could frame this as kind of like a connection between like idealism and materialism, but I don't think it's even that, because to me this is like a very materialist take on understanding utopia. Like there's a spot where they were able to actually experiment with these different ideas, the commune in Solentiname, and out of that experience they had a revolution. But this question is, to what extent is utopia necessary to sustain revolutionary ideas, is really interesting, because I guess my point is that in the contemporary situation of the left and the Christian left, even more specifically, it's hard for us to imagine this utopic space. It's imagined to have, like, we don't really have this kind of same space to even imagine sort of revolutionary activity from. So maybe this is one way to think about Solentiname in our own particular struggle at the moment, thinking through the ways like how could this utopia inform our practice as Christian leftists or just leftists in general, and like what would it mean for us to revisit this idea of utopia?
Yeah, for sure. I like the way you put it just a minute ago too. This is kind of a materialist take on utopia, because like this is what the material conditions of Solentiname produced. I mean, Ernesto Cardenal has a lot of energy, so do a lot of other artists or whatever. But I mean, all you have to do is read a book like The Gospel in Solentiname to realize the real kind of like meat and potatoes of this whole story comes down to just like letting a bunch of people feel free to interrogate their own situations. And that's what makes the art so important and fascinating as well. Like, there are a bunch of photographs included in here. And if you go and look up some of the stuff that is mentioned, like, it's forceful and arresting precisely because it is trying to respond to the material conditions, and it's bringing these utopic dreams into that. So, you know, like the bits from the Mass that I was reading earlier, you know, believing in Christ the comrade who is everywhere, right? Like in the hut, the factory, the school, and this kind of ceaseless struggle. It's a really important putting together of the utopic vision of, or even the mystic vision of Christ being everywhere, but being here specifically in a place like Solentiname, or in other parts of Nicaragua in general. And I think that's like a really important lesson. It's one that is hard for leftists to like wrap their head around sometimes, because there can be a little bit, I think, of like a bias between materialist and idealist or utopic visions. People kind of are like suspicious of both of those things from either side. But what's wild about Solentiname is this is a place where like these things didn't really live in tension. Like they worked together, and they ended up producing like an actual revolutionary situation and actual revolutionaries, like actual people who were invested. So I guess one way to kind of close this out, just adding on, I guess, to that that last note, is to just highlight again how important it is that Cardenal has been rehabilitated by Pope Francis. When you get a sense of the real life that this person has lived, it is wild to think that this guy is a real life Catholic priest. Like, not just a Catholic guy, not just a theologian or an artist or whatever, but somebody who is technically, legally now, in the church sense, trusted to carry out all the duties of church life. And it's too bad that he had to wait till he was 94 to get back to that situation, but it is a really amazing thing, and something that I think should give us hope a little bit. Like, if we can dare to have a little bit of hope, it's events like this that are not meaningless. Like, it isn't irrelevant that at 94 years old, a cardinal had to ask for Ernesto Cardenal's blessing. That's a really massively important thing, and hopefully we can keep sort of being inspired by his priestly ministry and his revolutionary ministry as well.
Thanks for listening to the Magnificast. If you like what you heard in this episode, you can support us on Patreon, patreon.com/themagnificast. You can also follow us on Twitter, join our Facebook group, or just write us a letter and say hi. You can't really do that, but it would be cool if you could.
An e-letter.
Yeah. Thanks to Maria Armstrong for the intro music. Thanks to the Illogical Spoon for the outro music. And I don't know, anything else we should talk about?
Nope, I think that's good.
Cool. See you next time.
I don't wanna get up for church in the morning, souls alive. Heaven come to earth and there won't be no church. We'll meet down by the riverside. There we'll swim with all creation. Never get tired, never bored, don't